I'm in the process of creating a program for women of faith who have moved on from an abusive relationship but are frustrated with overthinking, being triggered, and having the same repetitive struggles in their new relationships. So I figured it might be helpful to share my experience with relationship trauma, moving on, and finally healing from the past. I'd like to preface this with a disclaimer that this was my lived experience. The people involved in my trauma may or may not have intended harm. I may never know their rationale. I've spent many years healing and can acknowledge where my own faults likely played into my experience, though it does not excuse the actions of those involved. I have reached a place of forgiveness for those involved, and I have no ill will toward them. In fact, I pray for them regularly that they would allow Jesus to fill the spaces in their hearts that they've sought to fill in dysfunctional ways. That being said, forgiveness does not always go hand in hand with reconciliation, and I maintain certain boundaries for my mental health. Trigger warning: you might not want to proceed if you struggle hearing about mental abuse situations. My relationship trauma involved my dad and my first husband. It took years to recognize the similarities in them. I spent so much time seeing them through rose-colored glasses and holding them up on pedestals built with the good traits I saw in them. Seeing the good in people can be a blessing and a curse. With solid boundaries and a healthy, balanced view of people, seeing the positive traits allows me to see the soul in them that God loves. But without boundaries and having a heart desperate for love and acceptance, it only leads to justifying poor behaviors and hoping for change that the other person has no intention of making. Needless to say, that was me. I never felt like my dad wanted me around. I remember thinking that if I was a boy, maybe then he would have wanted to spend time with me. I recall many moments when I was just in the way or doing something wrong. To some extent, this is normal for children to hear, but it was always conveyed in anger and just brushing aside without any positive interaction to balance it out. What that told my child brain was that I wasn't wanted, but it didn't keep me from trying. I was convinced there was something I could do to make my dad want me. Living with a belief that love has to be earned became detrimental. No matter what I did, it wasn't enough. Perfect grades? Not enough. Great performance with standing ovation? Not enough. Fitting into the groups I told were important? Not enough. Over the years, my dad chose work and women over me. I finally decided that I'd had enough of wishing he would choose me. I was tired of being hurt, let down, and chastised for imaginary faults he accused me of. So at the age of 30, I finally called it quits. It has brought peace and consistency to my life. The relationship trauma with my first husband followed certain similarities. I felt like a low priority, brushed aside when he was around other people, but I thought our time together was filled with love. Maybe somewhere in there it was, but over time, that feeling became tarnished. Early in the relationship, video games were the top priority. He spent hours upon hours gaming. Date nights were canceled, time together was canceled, responsibilities were canceled, and any time that I made a request to prioritize anything else, I was met with anger. When we'd first started dating, I was told he was seeing someone else, but he denied it, deflecting the accusation with a question. Was I going to believe someone I didn't know, or him who I'd known for 4 years? I chose him. There were girls that he would stay up late chatting with on the games he played. If I asked questions about the nature of their relationship, I was told that I was insecure, jealous, and controlling, and he should be allowed to have friends. I conceded. A couple years later, he joined the military. There were frequent stories of him and another guy going out of the town, but he always said that he had to help make sure the other guy didn't do anything stupid. Naively, I believed him. After we got married and I moved to where he was stationed, I struggled with severe depression and suicidal ideation. We had the same fights, plus financial issues. The house I'd found was marketed as being close to base, but I didn't know how large that base was, so it was still too far. He had issues getting to work on time. I woke up earlier and earlier to try to help get him out the door. I even took him gear if he forgot it. I tried to be a good wife, but there was always a fight anyway. Everything was my fault for not finding something better. I had no support system, and my mental health declined rapidly. One night, I was battling suicidal ideation hard. I kept getting up out of bed to get the gun out of the closet, then would turn away and try to think of reasons to stay. I did this multiple times before I finally woke him up asking for help. His response was that he had to get up early to go to work. and I needed to just figure it out. Here's my dog trying to give me loves. Good girl. I called the suicide hotline and took myself to the ER. I spent 3 days in the psych ward. He visited. That was his opportunity to show me that he was a good husband, apparently. So I thought we were going to be okay. Once, when my parents came to visit, all I wanted was a dinner out altogether. That became a screaming match about how I never took his desires into account. My mom cried at the things he said to me during that fight. She encouraged me to suggest counseling. Instead, I ended up pregnant, which allowed us to move on to base and relieved much of the financial and time struggles that were there. I'd hoped things would improve, and to some extent they did. He deployed during that pregnancy, and I was left to manage everything else at home. That was a different struggle. He often spent too much money, and I was left to figure out how to pay the bills. One situation that felt like a red flag was a high amount spent at a bar. He said he stayed for hours talking to some Aussie men there, so I believed him. But after the deployment, when I was washing his laundry, I found condoms in his pockets. My heart sank. I just had our baby about 3 months prior. I was a child of divorce, and I didn't want that for my son. My ex had an excuse that really made no sense, but I had a choice to make. Would I ignore what I felt to be true and try to hold my marriage together for my son, or would I leave? I chose to keep trying. We did a little counseling with the chaplain, and I thought there was hope. The gaming issue was still in play, but we tried playing together so it didn't feel so isolating. Once he got out of the military, we moved back home where we'd gone to college. He ended up getting hired on with one of the law enforcement agencies and had to go to another town for the academy. This was held on a college campus, and pretty quickly after he left, he quit calling to talk to our son or to chat before bedtime. When I tried reaching out, he always answered as if he was angry that I'd called. Conversation was short and rude. Something felt off, so I looked at the phone bill where all of the numbers are listed. The same number was being called and texted at all hours of the night and in the early morning. Again, my heart sank. I called the number and a female answered, so I asked about the nature of their conversations, and I asked whether she knew he was married with a child at home. She didn't say much, but after I hung up, my ex called and yelled at me for harassing his friends. He told me how I was crazy, imagining things and jumping to conclusions. Again, I had the same choice to make: stick it out for my son or call it quits and move on. I chose to stay. During that time, he had also told me that the reason things felt different between us was because I was too fat and he was no longer attracted to me. So, while he was gone for training, I worked out hard. I lost a lot of weight and embraced the clothing style he said he preferred. I was desperate to rekindle what I thought had existed. We stuck it out. After that training, there were numerous issues that arose around female friends. His conversations were often sexual in nature, and he laughed it off, saying that was just how cops were and that I was a prude. There were so many red flags over the years. Yet, I chose to stay for my son. Over and over again, I was certain he was cheating, but he always made me feel like I was imagining things. So I learned not to trust my intuition. Between all of that, there were constant arguments over the gaming, secrecy over his phone and emails, housework that wasn't done to the standard he'd expected, meals not being prepared in anticipation of him arriving home to eat, and many other little things I apparently did wrong. I kept trying. I lived in a state of panic every time the garage door opened. I'd rush around picking up toys from the living room so I could avoid his anger. I scheduled meals to be ready at predictable times around his work schedule, and if he didn't make it in time, I just put it in the microwave and reheat it as soon as the garage door opened. If he was in the office playing games, my son was expected not to bother him. That was his important space to decompress after work, and having our son there was an imposition, so I often kept my son in the room with me. I'd begun a master's program at the local college and was taking a full load of classes, so half the time my son sat with me as I read him the chapters of my textbooks, or I read him the papers that I wrote. My son was my everything, and he was truly the only reason I was still alive. At one point, I found evidence of an online relationship in which he told the girl that he loved her. My heart broke. Here I was, killing myself to try to be perfect, and he was telling some woman states away that he loved her. I confronted him about it and gave him the ultimatum. He had to pick one. Sometime within that week, he decided he didn't want to be away from his son and that it was better to try to work things out. So we went for counseling again. Counseling was always a struggle. everything was my fault. I was too emotional, too jealous, irrational, too suspicious, etc. The phone became a trigger, and the person counseling us basically just walked me through exposure therapy and trying to change my mindset about what he was doing on the phone. A side note here, narcissists are very good at playing the victim and making themselves out to be the hero of the story. And if a counselor is not aware of narcissism as an issue, they will almost always partner with the narcissist in trying to fix the other person. But as I was experiencing it, I had no idea this was going on. I thought maybe all the stuff he had been saying about me was true because the counselor agreed. So I tried harder. I ignored emotions, shoved thoughts away, and tried making up other scenarios in my head that might excuse the odd behaviors. I kept maintaining the weight that seemed ideal, kept obsessing over the house being perfect, and kept burning the candle from every end possible, trying to be the kind of wife I thought he wanted. Somehow, I did all those things and graduated with my master's with straight A's. That brought me confidence. I got a job at a school so that I could work the same schedule as my son's school schedule, and I managed everything in the same way. Still, all of the problems that arose were blamed on me. Financial stuff, maintenance issues, parenting difficulties, his tiredness, his stress, any problem was because of me. At my job, I found peace. I made friends and I gained a support system. This was the first time I was told that my ex-husband sounded abusive. I often arrived at school in tears, and the teacher across the hall was always waiting to make sure I got sorted out before students came in. She was wonderful. She was encouraging and only had compliments to give. It was such a difference from the way I was treated at home, which helped build my confidence more and more. I remember the first time that I told my ex I felt like he was being abusive. He responded with all the things he had seen on domestic violence calls, which were always physical things, asking then if he did any of those things, and since the answer was no, he insisted he was not abusive and I had a skewed view. At this point, I was feeling confused. I knew what I felt, but I also knew the point he was making. So I began to do some research on definitions of emotional and mental abuse. I was starting to see what was at play, though I still doubted whether what I was feeling accurately reflected the circumstances. I spent a lot of time justifying his behaviors and looking for positives. Over the years, I continued to struggle with depression and suicidal ideation, and after I started teaching, I began to have hemiplegic migraines, which cause similar symptoms to a stroke. Half my body will just quit functioning. Looking back, this feels like the first physical sign that I'd been pushing for too long without rest. Rest wasn't safe, though. Rest meant I'd be accused of laziness, and I've had all the imperfect things thrown in my face. If I was busy all the time, the lack of perfection was somewhat excusable. At least it was met with sighs and snide comments rather than full-on cruelty. When I saw doctors to sort out what was going on with my mental health, they always asked about stress and my situation at home. Every doctor mentioned mental abuse, but I still wasn't positive. Maybe I was being dramatic, which is what he'd been saying for years. I'd internalized so many of his words, and they hindered me from looking at anything objectively. Life was hard, really hard. I'd go through cycles of positivity while trying to imagine that there were innocent motives between his actions. And then, when the effort to do that was too high, I'd fall into a spiral of depression because I could not live up to his standards. In those darker moments, I'd tell him I was feeling suicidal, but rather than being met with the support I desperately needed, I was met with taunting. If your life is really bad, that bad, just do it already. The gun's right there, so obviously you're not serious. You're just looking for attention again. I often left the house to walk and to remove the temptation to harm myself. No one else was going to help me. So I had to figure out how to survive for my son's sake. Looking back, I truly don't know how I did it other than knowing God was with me. I didn't necessarily want to die, but I also didn't want to live like that anymore. I just wanted relief from the pain, and I'd found none. I knew I needed to be around for my son. And that's when my ex began to criticize my parenting ability. He would tell me that my mental instability was unhealthy for my son, that I was not being a good role model, and that I was too gentle on him, and that was the reason for all the difficult behaviors. There's so much more that occurred, but I think you get the situation and the cycle is clear. When I finally stood up to my dad, the dam broke. I was stronger. I had boundaries I was going to enforce. I was done putting up with being treated like crap when I did nothing to deserve it. A few days later, my ex notified me that he wanted a divorce. Christmas was about 2 days after that, and we did what we could to help my son still have a good Christmas. I actually thought there was hope still. But as soon as the courts opened up, he went and filed. He actually had the audacity to tell me we just needed a break and we could get together again later. When he finally moved out, I began to find peace and freedom. I could decorate as I chose. I could wear the clothes and shoes I enjoyed. I could put on music and sing. Toys could stay out. There were so many little things I began to notice were suddenly easier. The loneliness was a struggle, but I could finally spend time with friends without being interrupted by constant calls. I could go out for coffee or dinner. I could cook whatever I wanted without having to hear about the smells that he didn't like. I maintained my home on a schedule that worked for me. I could finally breathe. I could finally rest. But the nights were hard. When I was alone, my mind was filled with all the awful things that I'd been made to believe about myself. I created a routine of intentional crying sessions to try to clear out all the grief I was feeling and all the emotions I had stuffed down for years. I had this great jacuzzi tub with wide sides surrounding it, so I could light candles all around myself. I'd pour bubbles in and pour a glass of wine. Not really supposed to do that. And then I'd turn on some relaxing piano music, and I just ruminated on whatever pain was on my mind. I'm not sure I would suggest this any other time, but in this situation, it worked for me. I would ugly cry until nothing else would come out. Then I would change my perspective and look at the situation as if it were someone else's life. I began to see how the things he'd said about me were untrue, and I was able to move past those words. Little moments like this brought more confidence and satisfaction. There was an issue at one point with the sprinkler head. He told me I wouldn't be able to figure it out. Nope, I figured it out. Every little thing that came up that he said I couldn't do, I proved that I could. As I gained confidence, then he became flirtatious when we exchanged custody of my son. We, we did go out on a date at one point, but all through the movie and after, he was glued to his phone texting someone. When we left the theater and were walking to the front door, he never looked up from his phone. So I pushed the door open, walked through, and let the door go. It hit him, and he finally looked up, angry that I let the door hit him. I bit back that he could have simply put his phone away and watched where he was going. I told him that if he had been anyone else, there would never be a second date, that I was done entertaining the idea that we'd get back together. I needed to move on. I deserved to be treated better than that. He told me I'd never find someone who would treat me the way I wanted, that my standards were too high, and that no man could live up to them. He told me that frequently over the years when I'd asked for any improvement in our relationship. At this point in my life, though, I didn't care. I was better off alone than being treated like that. About 4 months after my divorce was finalized, I got curious about whether my intuition was trustworthy, and I decided to test it out and see what other men were like. I joined a free online dating app and made a profile. Quite quickly, I was able to identify all the red flags. The patterns were all the same. They said the same things and had the same intentions. It was helpful to test my intuition and allow conversations to continue until I was proved correct. I wasn't crazy. That was a big revelation. I'd intended to be done with the dating app, but then I met Johnny. Johnny did not use the same lines. He sent this genuine compliment as the opening to our conversation. This one was different. Long story short, because I could go on forever and ever about how wonderful my now husband is, Johnny and I hit it off. He was gentle and patient with me. He genuinely listened, complimented me, encouraged me, supported me, held me when the depression hit, and he was sensitive to the things that triggered me. I was diagnosed with PTSD after my first marriage, and there were so many triggers related to relationships. Johnny would make an effort not to turn his phone away from me when he was on it. He shared conversations with me to set my mind at ease. He took the time to listen to what I was saying and help find a compromise. He actually put compromises into practice and changed whatever it was that I felt like would help. We could talk about anything, and it was just easy. Johnny was an adventure, and he was helping me see the truth about myself, slowly disproving all the things my ex had said. I was extremely volatile and constantly second guessed myself. And for whatever reason, Johnny stayed and worked through it. Looking back, I put the poor man through hell, but God bless him. He walked through the fire with me, and we have come out on the other side with incredible strength in our marriage. Johnny is the embodiment of everything I needed and wanted in a partner, which only further proved my ex wrong. There was a man out there who would treat me as I wanted to be treated. Better, in fact. I can't say it's all sunshine and rainbows. We're human and we still have our struggles, but that's life. The healthiest marriages still have struggles. It's how we react to those struggles that defines us. My life with Johnny has been quite a journey. We've walked through all the ups and downs, committed to making it work. We are equal parts to the whole, both putting in the work to provide a stable and supportive environment for the other. I've lived through all sorts of abuse. I understand being in the thick of it, learning to live again on my own, co-parenting after it, and finding stability in a new marriage. I've walked alongside many friends through similar experiences. Every stage requires support and encouragement, though admittedly that looks different depending on the factors at hand. I found that traditional counseling only helped so much. Eventually, I was told there was nothing else to be done to help me. I set out to figure it out on my own and can honestly say that I did. The missing link was God, and He has healed so many of my wounds. He has redefined who I am and given me purpose and a hope that keeps me moving forward. If you're still in the thick of it, I don't judge. After all, I didn't leave. He did. I know how hard it is to make that choice. If you had the strength to leave, I commend you. I know how hard it is to set out on your own. If you're walking in this uncertain, broken state, often experienced after such struggles, I want to encourage you. There is hope of healing. I've experienced it and I've witnessed it time and time again. If you're in a new relationship feeling frustrated that there are still struggles, I also want to encourage you. It takes time to heal. The problem is not innately you, but your body reacting in protection to situations that were dangerous in the past. This too can be healed. To anyone who's ever experienced relationship trauma, they lied. You are worthy of love, and you deserve good things. These experiences, and far worse, are far too common in our world. But you're not alone in this. Ecclesiastes 1:9 says, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." Unfortunately, evil exists in the world, and it seeks to harm the innocent, the loving, and the kind. It's nothing new, but that doesn't mean you have to live this way. There is hope, freedom, peace, and a life of beauty ahead. And I hope you persevere until you find it.